Hey folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Thursday Dairy Update. I'm Kathy Barrett with the Cornell Pro Dairy Program, and Pro Dairy, along with Dairy Business East, is pleased to be able to offer these weekly webinars every Thursday from 1 to 2 p.m. And today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on shredlage. And we're pleased to be able to have Dr. Larry Chase with us today to provide our presentation. I think most everybody knows Larry, but of course, long-term professor here at Cornell, does reams of research and teaching and extension here for us for the college and for the dairy industry as a whole. And so he's the professor emeritus right now, and he gets to pick and choose what he'd like to do. And fortunately for us, this is one of the things he chose to do. So it's going to be a really interesting presentation for you today. We're going to be able to hone in on this whole idea of shredlage, lots of interest in the field about where we're at with it. And so Larry's going to go ahead and address that for us. So with that, what I just want to mention before I pass it on to Larry is that we do record these webinars, so they will be on the Pro Dairy website, and it takes me a few days to get them up there, but so in the next few days, if you have somebody who is not able to join us today and would like to, you'd like to share this presentation with them, it'll be on the Pro Dairy website. And in addition, if you have questions, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask, or you can use the chat box to type in your question, and we'll probably answer the chat box questions at the end of the presentation. So please don't be shy. If you have a question, pipe up. It's a little bit different in this format, but we'd like to hear what you're thinking and make sure that you understand what was presented today. So now, with that, I'm going to turn the screen and the mic over to Dr. Larry Chase, and he will talk to you about shredlage. Let me go ahead and pull up Dr. Chase's slide presentation. And there we go. There you go, Larry. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And it's nice that Pro Dairy and Dairy Business East are putting together these webinars, because I think it's a new way and a good way to get some information. And hopefully you'll gain something out of this, and hopefully you'll be able to participate in some of the other ones that are coming up in the near future. So today we want to chat a little bit about shredlage and what we've learned with it over the last 3 or 4 years. As most of you realize, corn silage is our major forage fed on most of our New York dairy farms. And there's been a lot of changes in corn silage genetics and management in the last 10, 15 years. So our corn silage that we have today looks a little bit different in terms of composition and availability to the animal than it did a few years ago. We also get higher yields with changes in plant genetics and management systems. And a couple examples of the changes that have occurred in the past are the brown midrib corn silage, and years ago the introduction of kernel processing. So the question now is, where does shredlage fit into this system, and how does it work? I think it's important to remember when you look at corn silage, it's 2 plants. It's a grass forage fiber attached with some corn grain in the cob. So when we think about it, we have to think both about the stover digestibility of the fiber and the grain digestibility of the corn grain. So it's a two-phase crop, different than alfalfa, which is really sort of just a one-phase crop. Kernel processed corn silage has been around for a number of years, and it's being used very widely. It has the opportunity to increase both starch and fiber digestibility. And if you look at research studies, there were this summary of 22 studies, the average milk response was a little over 1 pound a day, range from, you can see, -1 to almost 4 pounds a day. You get more benefit with mature and drier forages, which makes sense because the kernel is harder and it's more difficult for the animal to break down the nutrients. So if we break the kernel up and provide more surface area, it's easier for the human microorganisms to attack and digest it. And there are units available for almost all types of forage harvesters, either pull behind or self-propelled. About 3 or 4 years ago, shredlage came on the scene And this is just a picture of the equipment that choose.
It was just like one of our kids.
I know. I told them that. I said, no, they...
And this is just a series of rollers that counteract. And what they do is they shred the material instead of chop it. And when I first heard about this in 2011, I really said, if the only thing this does is lets us decrease the amount of hay or chopped straw we feed in diets, that would be worth a lot of money. Excuse me a minute. If we can also improve fiber and starch digestibility, that would give us some added value to the crop. So what is it? It's longitudinally ripped forage, increases surface area, and we'll show a picture of it in a minute. And basically it smashes the corn kernels better than some of the earlier kernel processors. And usually it started out with a fairly long chop length, 26 to 30 millimeters, where kernel processors usually are running like 17 to 19. So what are the potential benefits? Well, potentially better kernel processing. If we process the kernel better, it should give us more starch digestibility, potentially more fiber or NDF digestibility, and since it's a longer particle size, more physically effective NDF or chewing rumination activity. So this is a picture of what shredlage looks like. This was chopped at a 30 millimeter length, and you can see a lot of very coarse particles of the fiber. Most of you would say, well, that looks like a pretty coarse material. In the animals, we're going to do a lot of sorting of that in terms of when you feed it to the cows. We'll talk about the sorting issue a little bit later. This is a photo from Kevin Chinner's University of Wisconsin with shredlage on the left and kernel processing on the right. So again, you can just see the difference. The shredlage has more of the longer, coarse particles, which is why people say it may have more physically effective NDF to stimulate chewing, rumination, and mat formation in the rumen. Excuse me. However, on the shredlage, you can vary the theoretical length of cut. And this is from Michelle Woodman in Wisconsin. If you go a 30 millimeter theoretical length of cut, you get about 35% of that top screen. If you move it down to 22 millimeters theoretical cut, it goes to about 18. If you move to 17, it goes to about 9, which is similar to other kernel processing. You see the conventional is very similar to the 17 millimeter theoretical length of cut with the shredlage unit. So we can vary the length of cut and get different particle sizes, and that's one of the questions that will be addressed later, is what is the best theoretical length of cut in the shredlage harvesting process. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the kernel processing score. It's a quantitative way to evaluate how well the kernels are processed or broken up. It was developed by Dave Mertens at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center, and it uses a dried sample and a shaker with a number of sieves, and you look at the percent of starch that passes 4.75 millimeter sieve. So if greater than 70% pass, they classify it as excellent. If it's less than 50%, they classify it as poor. So it's just a quantitative score we can get to say, how good of a job did we do of processing and breaking up the kernels? These are some results from Dairyland Lab in Wisconsin, 2013. On the right, this is percent of starch passing. On the right, you see 10% were optimum, about 60% were okay, and about 28% were under-processed. And so again, I think if we look at data from Cumberland Valley Labs, you get a similar type answer. However, the industry has made changes, and this is data from Cumberland Valley from 2006 to 2014. And you see the average kernel processing score has gone up from 52.8 to over 60%. So the industry is making progress and probably paying more attention to this, even with conventional processors. So how much could this really mean? Well, Randy Shaver at Wisconsin has estimated that if you have poor processing versus adequate, it might cost you 2 pounds of milk, or take a couple pounds more corn in the ration. On the other hand, if you have excellent processing instead of adequate, you might gain a couple pounds of milk or be able to slide back a pound or two of corn in the ration. So that's Randy's estimate of what it might mean in some practical terms. Charles Hanson's lab in Wisconsin did an extensive trial in the Midwest a few years ago, and he looked at the fecal starch levels in herds and processing score. So in this chart, the kernel processing score is the red, starting out at about 75 on the left and going down. The blue is the fecal starch, which starts on the left at around 3 or 4% and then moves up. And you can see from this chart that as kernel processing score decreases, there's more fecal starch, more starch in the feces. That's not what we're after because we're growing the corn for energy for the cows. If it's in the feces, then the animal's not gotten full value. So what does this really mean? Well, Jim Ferguson, University of Pennsylvania, did a trial, and they looked at the relationship of digestibility versus fecal starch. So this is digestibility of starch versus amount of starch in the feces. And you can see that as you get an increased level of fecal starch, you get a decrease in digestibility of starch in that total tract. What does this mean? Well, if we put it in simple terms, if we accept 3% fecal starch as sort of a base good number, Jim Ferguson's data says you lose about 0.7 pounds of milk per unit of increased fecal starch. So if we had a 5% fecal starch versus 3, it would be a loss of about 1.4 pounds of milk. And you can see that this gets up to 4, 5, 6 pounds of milk at higher levels of fecal starch. So the fecal starch could be an index that we could use on herds to get an idea of total tract starch digestibility. And that might fit in with our evaluation of processing scores, whether it's conventional or with Shredlage. So if we move to Shredlage, there's only been about 3 university trials and one on-farm trial so far. And Randy Shaver at Wisconsin and his group have done 2 trials, and these are some slides provided by Randy and his group, updates on the corn silage shreddage work they've done in Wisconsin. They basically have done 2 trials, and on the top TLOC, that's the theoretical length of cut, and you see in both times the Shredlage had a larger theoretical length cut, being 26 to 30 millimeters. Conventional kernel processing was about 19. If you get down to the bottom and look percent on the top screen of the Penn State 4-inch separator box, in trial 1, there was 32% on the top for Shredlage versus 6% for the kernel processing. In trial 2, it was 18 versus 7. So there is more on the top screen of the Penn State box with Shredlage. But if you add the top 2 boxes together, you can see the differences are small. They're very similar on the top 2. So you're shifting it from the medium-sized particle to the longer-sized particle when you do the Shredlage harvesting technique. The roll gap settings, or the the settings for the rolls to smash the kernels, you can see they were running about around 2 millimeters, maybe 2.5. And the processing scores, again, in trial 1, Shredlage was 75, which is excellent. The control was 60, which is acceptable. And in trial 2, they both came in very close to that 70% value. So trial 2 says that if you have a conventional processor, kernel processor, and make the appropriate adjustments, you can get very close to that 70% number. So when they did these trials, we're just going to do a very simple overview. Forage is about 60% of the ration in the first trial, 55 in the second. Excuse me. Corn silage about 50% of the ration versus 45. And they try to maintain the forage MDF and starch levels similar between the rations and protein and everything. So the big difference was really just whether it was processed, kernel processing, or shredlage. So if we look at the results real quick, in neither trial was there a difference in dry matter intake between the two treatments. Milk yield, they got somewhere around 2.5 pounds of milk difference, and that was not statistically significant, but tended to be a difference. No difference in feed efficiency, no difference in milk fat and milk protein, a little bit improvement in milk components, because if milk goes up and the components are the same, you gain a touch in milk components. So they were saying maybe there's a couple pounds of milk here. When they looked at the total tract starch digestibility in both trials, Shredlage gave a response, positive. Also, in the ruminal starch digestibility, there was an advantage to Shredlage. So you're getting more use of it in the rumen as a source to grow microbial protein by the rumen bugs. You're getting more total tract digestibility, which means more total energy to the cow. When they looked at nutrient-detergent fiber digestibility, in the first trial they did get a positive effect. Second trial they had no effect. Now the one difference is in trial 2 it was brown midrib corn silage, in trial 1 it's conventional corn silage. That may have impacted the differences they found in total tract diet, nutrient-detergent fiber digestibility. In ruminal nutrient-detergent fiber digestibility, they really didn't get a response in either trial. So that's a quick summary of the work at Wisconsin. We did one trial years ago. We used conventional hybrids in a number of fields because we were filling large bunkers. We had 2 cross choppers that ran side by side in the field at the same time. So we were filling 2 silos simultaneously, rotating different truck. Each truck would go to a different silo. One chopper had the shredlage head, the other had the kernel processing head. So you can see we filled 2 large bunkers at the same time, trying to get things as close as we could. We used the Penn State box to sort of, as we went, to check particle size to make sure we weren't getting either too long or too fine. And we used the Pioneer cup, and we'll talk about that in a minute, what that is and how to use it to adjust our roll gap settings. It might be important to think about the fact that the silage was stored about 8 months before feeding, and that may have improved the starch digestibility of both forages. As it sits in the silo longer, you tend to get an improvement in starch digestibility. That may have some impact on the results. This just shows the packing situation with running 2 tractors in each silo at the same time. One of the questions of Shredlage is, what does it do to packing density in the silo? And the work that we did at Cornell, this is sort of our Shredlage and KP, this is pounds per cubic foot. The left bars are on a wet basis. The other two bars are on a dry matter basis. You can see there's really little or no difference in packing density. And that's similar to some work was found in some work at Wisconsin also. So really, if we do get the appropriate amount of tractor weight and time, we can end up with even though it's coarser material, we still get a very good packing density with the Shredlage. We look at the composition. We try to get them close, so dry matters are reasonably close. There's a small difference in NDF and starch for some reason, but if you look at the NDF digestibility at 30 hours, there's really no difference in our study. And the starch digestibility, 7 hour, was a little higher on Shredlage. So in theory, we have a touch more starch and we had a touch more digestibility. So that should have given us more nutrients available for milk production. Our processing scores were not as good as we had hoped for. They were, you can see 60 and 50. They're adequate, but they weren't as good as we had hoped. But that's what we were working with. Particle size in the Penn State box, again, Shredlage was about 35% on the top screen. The conventional was around 10. But if you add the top two together, they come out to be very similar. So again, we're shifting it from the medium particle size to the longer particle size. So the animal trial we did, we used four pens of cows, 32 cows per pen. These are cows in mid-lactation making over 100 pounds of milk when we started the trial. We fed all cows a common ration for a couple of weeks as a baseline, and we use that as part of our statistical analysis to adjust for potential differences between the groups. Each treatment period was 4 weeks in length, and each pen went through 3 treatment periods. Each pen had both gut Shredlage and KP at some time during the experiment. And the data was collected during the last week of the 4-week period. So they would be switched, given 3 weeks to adjust, then we would collect the data for that 4th week. Rations were 50% corn silage, 14% alfalfa, so they were 64% forage. And you can see the corn grain and protein mix. So the rations were basically the same in terms of composition of ingredients, as percent of dry matter. And we looked at the composition of the ration in terms of protein, starch, NDF, so on. Rations were very close to each other. Results, our cows didn't find any differences in intake, milk production, composition, or feed efficiency. And the average was about 90 pounds per cow in these trials, and you can see our milk fat was 3.7, our milk true protein was 3%. Fecal starch was not different between treatments. It was 1 to 2%, which is excellent. So we were getting good use of the starch in both the Shredlage and the kernel processed. And part of that may have been the fact that it was in the silo for the 8 months. Total track starch digestibility was similar between the treatments, 96, 98%. We also looked at sorting, and in our trial, we didn't have there was no sorting difference between the 2 rations. And that follows up with the Wisconsin group. In their trials, they've also found no sorting on the Shredlage rations compared with kernel processing. So even though it's a coarser particle size, and we have more in the top screen, it doesn't appear that the cows are doing the sorting of the Shredlage material. Recently, Dairy 1 conducted an on-farm trial on Allen Wheat farms in eastern New York, compared Shredlage and kernel-pressed corn silage. Diets contain about 22 pounds of dry matter from corn silage, or 38% of total ration dry matter, along with some haylage and the other diet ingredients. So the only difference in the diets was whether the corn silage was kernel processed or Shredlage processed. The rest of the diets were the same in terms of ingredients and composition. They only used cows in the 2nd or greater lactations. Again, a pen study. They used 2 pens with 152 cows per pen. The results only included the cows that were in each pen for the full 12 weeks. So there were always a few cows moving in and out. They were not counted. So there were like 136 to 140 cows in each pen that were there for the full 12 weeks. They recorded milk production every day for all the cows, and they used the feedlot system to determine the amount of feed delivered and the refusals. And if you want a full report of this trial, if you get on with Sally Fliss at Dairy 1, she can send me the report of the trial. Key results: intake was very similar between the two groups. Fat and protein was similar. There was about maybe 2 to 3 pounds more milk per day on the Shredlage diet. Fecal starch was less than 2%, indicating very good in both treatments. So in this trial, they found a touch, again, a little bit of milk production response. So there's some mixed results in the research so far in on-farm experiences. So let's move to the question of how we operate, where does this fit, and then some field survey work. So one of the questions is, during harvest, who should be monitoring particle size and kernel damage to make the adjustments on the chopper? And I think this is critical whether it's conventional kernel processed or Shredlage, either one. If you just make one adjustment at the beginning and don't change it as you go through harvest, you have different fields with different hybrids, moistures, maturities, everything else. And if you don't make adjustments, you can end up with a product that isn't quite what you want. Because if you don't get it right during harvest in terms of particle size and processing, then you have to live with it until that corn silage is fed out of the storage facility. The other question is, what's the best particle size? And we have a table we're going to show in a minute on that, some recommendations and guidelines from the Shredlage group. It looks like people are going a little bit shorter in Shredlage now than when it first came out. So instead of 26 to 30, maybe they're gone to 22 or something like that. It may depend on how much corn silage is in the ration and what other forages are fed. So if you have a high corn silage ration with limited haylage, you might want a coarser cut on the corn silage. And if you have a low corn silage, high haylage ration. This is adapted from the information from the Shredlage company in terms of their suggestions as you look at dry matter of the corn silage and the theoretical length of cut and the roll gap settings. So you can see if it's 30-34, they're thinking about 26 millimeters, and roll gap of maybe 1.75 millimeters. As it gets drier, they're suggesting making it somewhat smaller theoretical length of cut. You get down to 38 to 40%, you see you're down to 21. As it gets drier, you cramp the rolls down more to put more pressure and break the kernels up better. So how do you determine at the field level how good of a job you're doing with kernel processing? Well, there's a number of ways to do it. The simple way, I think, is Pioneer has a method, uses a 32-ounce cup. You can get one of those from the Pioneer people, or you can go to McDonald's and get a medium-sized drink. You fill the cup with incoming silage, you spread out the surface, and you look at the kernel pieces, greater than half a kernel. If you have more than 2 to 3 pieces of half a kernel or greater, you probably should tighten the rolls down and adjust your processing. So this is something you can do pretty quickly as those trucks are coming in the silo. Periodically, you can just grab a few samples, spread them out, and see if the roll adjustment needs to be made to improve that kernel processing. Maybe you hit a drier field, or a different hybrid, or a different yield potential or something, and you might need to change those settings. So what do we hear? Well, there's variation between fields. This is a specific farm where they just checked without changing settings. On 10 samples, they got processing scores between 38 and 59 on 10 fields, basically 10 different samples. So they should have been making adjustments as they went through. They attempted to monitor and change settings based on the box and the plein air cup, but they obviously didn't do that good of a job. A consultant indicated that on one farm he worked with, processing scores were 60 to 70%, and another 40 to 50 on another farm that he works with using the same custom harvester. What was the difference? In farm A, they had people at the farm that spent time evaluating the corn silage being harvested and adjusting the settings. On farm B, they really didn't do that. They just set the chopper settings at the beginning of harvest and they didn't readjust them. You can see the difference that ended up in those two herds by using management practice of adjusting those chopper settings as you went through harvest. And this is an example from Colin Holtz, from Holtz Nelson Consulting, two herds he worked with that were owned by the same family but in different parts of the state. And one herd feeds a high corn silage ration, so they used a coarser chop length, 26 to 28 millimeters. The other herd feeds a high haylage ration with lower corn silage, so they made the corn silage smaller because the haylage would have the particle size to stimulate the chewing rumination activity. Some comments that Corwin made at a meeting a year or two ago. What does Shredlage mean to him as a nutritionist? Well, potentially there's more rumen available and fermentable starch from corn silage, which means you could probably run total ration starch a little bit lower and still get the same amount of starch availability in the rumen and in the animal. You can get more of my desired starch from the home-produced corn silage, so you don't have to rely as much on the purchased corn grain, for example. And may also provide an opportunity to decrease the need for some of the straw, hay, and things like that in the grass that sort of take up space in the ration but don't give you a lot of nutrients. And so what does it mean to his clients? Well, potentially you don't need as much of the hay and straw, and potentially you can have less purchased starch or less corn grain. And he thinks he sees a little bit more better packing density, actually. So it's either equal to or better than the packing density with shredlage compared to kernel processing. He says it's very difficult at the herd level to show differences, but his best estimate is a pound or two of milk and maybe a pound less cornmeal. Well, even if the only difference was a pound less cornmeal and milk was the same, that still has some economic value in terms of less purchase feed costs. So what's happening out here at the farm level? In 2014, University of Wisconsin-Madison and VitaPlus, which is a feed company in the Midwest, did a farm survey of 69 farms, you can see, mainly Minnesota and Wisconsin, range in herd size, range in milk production. 61% of the farms used shredlage. Most of them were using bunkers or piles, and most of them used some type of silage inoculant. They had a whole bunch of questions they asked the producers, and again, the survey was, you ask the question producer and you're recording the producer responses, so it's that type of survey. It's not quantitative, but it's just sort of their impressions. So if you looked at the theoretical length of cut, you can see most of them are running 22 to 26, the people using shredlage. So that's sort of in the range that people are talking about. And again, whether you use 26 or 22 may depend on the amount of corn silage and the ration and dry matter, things like that. So at least the length of cut that they're using is in the range where the guidelines are. Roller bar spacing, or the spacing of the rolls, most of them are running around 2 millimeters. But you can see that some are cramping it down a little bit lower, a few a little bit coarser. So again, I think this is where we need to do that on-farm monitoring to know where the roller settings are. The tighter we make the rolls, it's going to increase the power needed to get that kernels moved through that spacing. And that's something we have to think about. Were they able to reduce the amount of hay or straw fed in the ration? About 40% of them said yes. A few said no, and the others obviously were in between, weren't sure. So some people were able to reduce a little bit the hay or straw in the ration. And if you think about that, if we could reduce straw, at least in New York, well, most of our herds, straw is an expensive item that we have to buy, and we have to grind it up and process it. So it has some negatives there. If we could reduce that, replace it with our corn silage, that might help a little bit in terms of labor and management and so on. What happened in milk production? Well, you see we got mixed results. 45% thought they gained a little bit of milk. 40% said there wasn't much of a change. A few people said it went down. A few were unsure. So, again, mixed results. Sort of like the research trials, whether you do or don't get an increase in milk. Some results say yes, some are not so sure. So the take-home points, I think, from this are, it does offer the potential to improve fiber to starch digestibility of corn silage, and it looks like starch is really the place where the biggest advantage is, potentially. The fiber digestibility is not seeming to be as much of an impact as the starch digestibility. A key concern we have to think about is how and who is going to monitor the harvester settings during harvest to make the change we need so we get that nice uniform product processed the way we would like it, feed the cows, and take advantage of the money we spent growing the crop. Even though milk production responses are mixed, it does seem to offer opportunity to lower ration costs. So even if milk didn't change, and we could reduce hay and or reduce corn a little bit, that would still give us some advantages in terms of economics. And we might, in some cases, maybe gain a touch or two of milk, but I think that's still to be decided on the milk response, because the results are mixed in Onfarm and research at this point. We probably still need better data on the particle size guidelines. I think the ones we have, we've got in the previous chart here, are good starting points. We might still need some more data like that. And as with many of our new technologies that come out, in the next 2 or 3 years, we'll probably find out where it really fits. It has potential, but again, the Shredlage units are only available on certain types of harvesters and choppers. And so maybe if you're buying new equipment, something to think about. If not, then maybe we can do a better job of our traditional kernel processing, and that might help us too. So at this point, I think we'll wrap it up. We'll say thanks for your attention and see if we have any questions or comments.
Thanks very much, Larry. That was excellent. So, folks, if you have any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself or type it into the chat box and we'll answer them for you. So while you're doing that, I just want to thank you all for joining us today, but also let you know that the next 2 weeks, next Thursday and the Thursday after, Dr. Mike Van Amber will be joining us, and he's going to be talking about the newest edition of the Cornell model, some of the changes, what difference it makes. He's particularly interested in some of the information he's been able to pinpoint about calf growth and heifer and replacements and sort of the whole economics behind that. So that's why he's split it into two webinars. So I hope that you can join us for that. And following that, we have Dr. Rick Waters from Quality Milk Promotion Services. He'll be joining us. And then a new professor to Cornell, Dr. Jennifer Itz. I hope I'm saying her name right. Is that right, Larry? It is, okay. And she'll be talking about valuing land, taking into consideration proximity and that sort of thing, trying to look at that a little bit more objectively as opposed to people kind of the feel they have for that. So anyway, those are some of the presentations that are coming up. Let me see now if we have any questions. I believe we do. Just let me look here and see. So you know what, I have that Andrew Cross, you had something there, so I'm just going to go ahead and unmute you, Andrew, and if you would just ask your question for us, we'd appreciate that. So you can go ahead, Andrew. For some reason I can't hear you. Well, Andrew, unfortunately,
You can type it in.
Yeah, could you maybe type it in? I don't know why it's not coming through for us. It should. I'm just typing into the chat box for Andrew to see if that helps prompt the questions, helps him see where you can type it in. We'll just give Andrew a second or two to do that. So he keeps, I see the number keep going up, and for some reason it's not coming through. Okay, here we go, got it. So Andrew asks, if using the longer TLOC shredlage at a typical 2/3 corn silage, 1/3 haylage ration, is it possible to get too much effective fiber in the ration?
At least the work so far, Andrew would say that some of the research trials have been very close to that 2/3, 1/3. And even when we have the length of cut around 25 to 30, without the sorting, we're not holding back intake. So the intake's similar to the kernel process, which is much finer. So it doesn't look like we're getting a negative effect of the longer particle size when we compare it to animals consuming the kernel process, which has a shorter particle length. So we're getting more effective fiber in the rumen, maybe a little bit better digestibility, even though we're not picking it up with the analysis. But it doesn't seem to be a negative at this point in terms of animal intake.
Okay, and then the other question for Larry, is there any information available from Larry with regards to costs of converting to shredlage processors or other roller options?
Okay, as I understand it, currently there's a linkage in the last year that's taken place between Kloss and Shredlage. So Kloss actually now is the one that owns the Shredlage. So the Shredlage heads are primarily cost choppers. There are some other companies that are making retrofit units that are supposedly similar. The cost, I think, is if you're getting a new chopper, instead of a kernel processor, I think it's an extra 10 or 15,000 for the Shredlage head, I believe. You can check that with your local dealer. The other thing to think about is it will take a little bit more power, fuel, and it'll be a little bit slower harvest in terms of tons per hour with the Shredlage.
Okay, so our next question is there any data or thoughts on length of cut for shredlage on BMR versus conventional? With conventional KP, we cut BMR shorter.
Well, the Wisconsin trial, the second trial, where they had BMR, they also cut both Shredlage. The Shredlage was shorter, about 21 or 22 in that trial. So they did go a little bit shorter on the BMR versus conventional in the Wisconsin work with trial 2 versus trial 1. So they did go shorter, just like you're doing with your conventional.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I guess we'll finish up there. Once again, for an excellent presentation, and folks, I hope that you will join us again next Thursday for the first part of Dr. Mike Van Amberg's presentation, use the same link and join us just by clicking. So we'll hope to see you, hear from you next Thursday. Thanks very much, folks.